Hi guys, this is Robin. I'm obviously General George Washington today. I made my own hat. And we are going to be talking about the Revolutionary War. Let's see, I think a lot of you guys have sort of joined already. Just as a reminder, type into, if you have any questions, we use the Q&A function. So type any questions into the Q&A box. We are not using the raise your hand function, so just type something into the Q&A box. And I see there are a lot of you guys here. Hi, Riley. Hi, Ariana, Elijah. Hi, guys. Thank you, Ariana. I'm glad I look just like him. I think it is the the paper curls that give it away. Hi, Gayatri, Aleta, Violet, Cypress. Hi. Thanks, guys, for joining me. Hi, Henry. Hi, Denali and Mackenzie. So glad you guys could join. And Ethan, Jacob, thank you, guys. Okay. So hopefully so we're going to talk about the Revolutionary War. Alette, thank you for reminding me. You're probably only going to have to remind me 100 more times before I actually remember. Okay, so this part, we are going to talk about the Revolutionary War Part 2, how the American colonies gained freedom from England. Sophia, no, I didn't make my hat with cotton balls. They're like paper curls that I made and then glued together. And oh, good, Ethan, your sister Jordan is there too. Great. Okay, so as we learned in the previous lesson, if you were with me in the previous lesson, by 1775, some things had gotten very tense between England and the colonies. One of those things were that the king was placing taxes on the things that the colonists were using, like paper, tea, glass, lead, anything you could think of, they had to pay a tax on, and there wasn't really any way to get around paying that tax. And then the Sons of Liberty, these men went and they dumped $2 million worth of tea in the harbor in Boston, and the king didn't like that very much. So one of the things that he did was he required colonists to have British soldiers living in their homes, which they also didn't really like. At the time, they started forming these armies called militias, which weren't official militias, but it was men, citizens, who were trained to fight as soldiers. Let's see if I can get to some of your guys' questions. Sorry, just one second. So they began to form militias to fight against the British. And some of these members of these militias were what was called Minutemen, because they could be ready to fight in 1 minute. They were totally prepared. Their stuff was by the door. As soon as they heard it was time for them to fight, they would get up and they would go fight. So they'd be done in a minute. Okay, good. Great. So they were ready to fight in 1 minute. So in 1775, Britain was the world's most powerful country. They had the most power of any of the other countries. And these colonists, they were hunters, farmers, and they were craftsmen, which means they made things by hand. They maybe made things out of leather or wood or different things like that. The militia and the Minutemen, they weren't actually a real army, but the colonists did have some advantages, which I'm going to talk about in my next slide. So here were some of the advantages. The British were fighting a war far from their home, and they had to send all their supplies, their soldiers, their orders over a great distance. So for the generals who were fighting for the British Army in the colonies, they had to wait to hear from the men who were sort of directing the war in England. So that obviously added some time and made it a little bit longer. They had to ship all their soldiers over. They had to ship all their supplies over. And if you were in one of my earlier webinars, it took about 6 to 8 weeks for those things to come over. So that was one of the reasons that, that they had a disadvantage. Another reason was that there was a lot of area in the colonies to fight the war over. So they had a lot of space, that it wasn't like there was one battlefield and they'd line up on both sides of it and they'd shoot at each other and whoever won the battle. They actually were fighting around hills and trees, behind rocks, boulders, all those things, which was hard for the British soldiers to get used to, but the colonists themselves were actually already used to it. See, you guys are asking some great questions. Shana says, Paul Revere was a Minuteman. Yes, he was. We're actually going to talk about him a little bit later in my presentation. I have a little bit of talking about him. And Shana also says, the Minutemen were always ready to be prepared. That's right. Sophia, they were fighting the British because they wanted to be able to control their own country. They wanted to be able to make their own laws and you know, be in charge of their own country rather than having this small, have this small country control them across the ocean. Welcome to anybody who just joined us. We are talking more about the Revolutionary War and some things that happened during that time. Devin, my costume today is I'm George Washington. But I couldn't find a hat and a wig, so I made my own. Okay, so another reason, or I think actually the most important reason that the colonists had an advantage over the British soldiers was that the colonists had a really strong reason for fighting. They were fighting for their freedom, they were fighting for their rights, and their ability to run their own country. They wanted to be in charge of the laws that were applied to them or that were made. And so they felt really, really strongly. And it was more than just fighting battles and trying to win battles. They had a big, huge goal of what they were trying to accomplish. And so I actually think that was the biggest advantage that the colonists had over them. Shana, the British just didn't give them their freedom because the colonies were their colonies. They were things that they owned, and the goods and things produced there could be sold to England or were sold to England. And so it was actually, to them, it was like the idea of giving up some of their land that they didn't want to do. Okay, good. So in April of 1775, the shooting, sorry, hold on, I think I missed. Okay, good. So in April of 1775, the shooting and the actual war part of it started for real when the British general, his name was Thomas Gage, decided to march his army 18 miles from the city of Boston to the city of Concord, Massachusetts. And the reason he did that was because he wanted to seize or take the supplies that the militias had built up. So like they wanted the guns and the maps and the food and the clothes and the bullets and the muskets and all those things that they had built up. So they were trying to get those things. But there were American spies who found out and secretly spread the word to the colonists in Boston. So one of these men who found out was Paul Revere. So some of you guys were talking about Paul Revere earlier. I'm sure if you've heard of him, his job was a silversmith, which means he made things out of silver for a living, whether it was pots, pans, tea kettles, spoons, picture frames, everything. And he was about 41 years old at the time. when General Gage was going to march on Concord. And he was a spy. He was an American spy. So his job was to watch and to talk about the different movements of the British troops. So he would always be watching, he'd be he'd be paying attention to what was happening, and then he would report back. I see a couple of people raise their hand, but don't do that. Will you type into the Q&A, and then I'll be able to answer your question. So he, along with some others, left the night before to warn the Americans along the road to Concord that the British soldiers were coming. You might have heard of this. It's called the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. He was saying, you know, he was going to let them know who was coming, and that the army was coming. Okay, so that's the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. There is a great, there's a poem that you guys could look up later that's called the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, and it tells the story of a man who's seen this happen. Shayna, yes, they did. The story in history is that they did say the British are coming, the British are coming. But I think more historically true is they said the army is coming, because they didn't differentiate between the British and them, because they were also British, though they were trying to fight for independence. Hi, Anjali, thanks for joining. Good, so that's the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Now I have a little map so you guys can see, so there are 3 colors on this map, right? So the yellow one is Paul Revere. He's the yellow line. So at the same time, there was also another man whose name was William Dawes, who was another man who set off to alert the Minutemen at the same time as Paul Revere. And he is the blue line. So the funny thing about William Dawes is Paul Revere is like the main guy who's known for alerting the Minutemen, but there was actually another man, William Dawes, who alerted the Minutemen. Some historians believe that the reason he's not as famous is because he wasn't arrested by the British soldiers. Paul Revere was captured by the British soldiers, but from what I read about William Dawes, he was actually very smart. Many times he was stopped by the British Army on his way to warn these people, but he thought of different ways each time to get out of it. One of the times he acted like he was a robber and that he was going to actually to stop or rob these British soldiers, and they ran the other way. He also, another time, supposedly joined a group of men who were traveling to look just like them so that he wouldn't be stopped. So Paul Revere, the yellow line, got captured by the British, but not before he had warned the Americans in Lexington along the way. Hold on one second, guys. So sorry, I'm having a slight technical difficulty. Okay, so he had warned them. Dr. Sam Prescott, who is the red line. So as you can see, so Paul Revere started from the Old North Church in Boston, and he followed this yellow line. He went to Buckman Tavern, And then where the X is, you can see that that actually was where he was captured by the British. But Dr. Sam Prescott, another spy and colonist who's the red line, actually made it to Concord. So they were warned as well. The blue line is who, like I was talking about, William Dawes, another patriot who set off to alert the Minutemen. Elijah, yes, William Dawes did sort of disguise himself so that he could pass by the British soldiers and not be caught. Isaiah, how long did it take for Paul Revere to get to Boston? Well, it just took him a little bit. I think that it just took him a little bit to travel there. William Dawes actually left an hour before him. So I imagine it didn't take him a super long time to do that. Annette asked what happened after he was captured by the British soldiers. Well, I'm sure he was locked up by them. And Elijah, yes, all those patriots were trying to go to the same place. They were trying to make it to Concord before General Gage and his army got there, so that they could be warned that they were coming to try to take their supplies, and so that they could protect them. You know, William Dawes, he actually, I think he just hooked up with a group of men who were passing through, and he actually didn't get attacked by the British soldiers. He wasn't arrested, and he was just able to go about his life. He returned to regular life. So because of Paul Revere's warning and William Dawes and Dr. Prescott, the 70 Minutemen in Lexington were ready when the 240 British soldiers arrived. So there is some debate or argument about who shot first. Probably it depends, like I've talked about before, which side of the story you're on. But there is some, so some people believe that the Minutemen shot first, and some people believe that the soldiers shot first. Oh, sorry, I went too far. But what we do know is that 8 Minutemen were killed. So, and the Minutemen were outnumbered. So I'm actually going to go back to one of my maps because I want to show you. So the thing that I was just talking about was in the city of Lexington. So you guys can see under the tavern is the city of Lexington. So these men, these 240 Minutemen were ready by the time the British reached Lexington. And so they had a little battle, 8 Minutemen were killed, and the ones who were outnumbered, they decided to retreat or pull back from the battle, and the army continued to march on to Concord. So see if I can answer the questions. Amelia, is there anybody who lived through that who's alive? No, it was far enough away that to know these stories, we have to just depend on the letters and different things that people wrote. Ariana asks, how did Paul die? I'm not sure exactly how he died, but he lived to be the age of 83, and that was a long time during that. Noah, for that battle in Lexington, it was the British who we consider won, because they had a much larger number than than the Minutemen. This was about 300 years ago. So the British, they continued to march on to Concord. But when the British approached Concord, there were almost 400 Minutemen who were ready to fight. It's possible that those ones that were left from Lexington kind of circled around the back and were ready to fight. And they fired on the British, and they actually forced them to retreat back to Boston, which was a huge victory for the Minutemen at that time. So from behind, like earlier, I talked about how the land was different and how they had to fight in and around things. So from behind rocks and trees, the Minutemen shot at the retreating British all the way back to Boston. So they followed them all the way back to Boston and shot at them. You can see kind of a cool picture, or some pictures that I found here showing them sort of following the British Army. So in total, 73 British soldiers were killed and 174 were wounded. And that was really, those battles are what we consider the beginning of the Revolutionary War. The Battle of Lexington and the Battle of Concord. Elijah asks a great question. So why didn't the ones in Lexington fire at the British backs? I'm sure some of them probably did, but they were outnumbered. There were too many of the British soldiers and not enough of them. And I think they probably had the idea to retreat so that they could circle around and fight some more. Yes, Henry, I can see your comments. I do agree that the bridge would be a good tactical advantage. I'm not sure if these pictures are accurate, historically accurate, but they were drawn by people at that time. So I can just imagine that's how we can imagine that it looks like. So what was it that the Americans and what the colonists really wanted? They wanted more freedom to control their government. They wanted to be able to control their government by electing the people in it and not being bossed around so much by a king who was thousands of miles away. So to win, they'd need an army and a good general. So they got General George Washington, me today. General George Washington, he was 43 years old when the war started. He had some experience fighting in a war because he had led some soldiers during the French and Indian War, which happened before the Revolutionary War. So in 1775, he helped form, and then he took command of the Continental Army, which is what the colonists called their army. So the army of the 13 colonies was called the Continental Army. It was made up of Americans and colonists who were willing to fight to be free from the British, and they wore blue coats, which you can see in the picture. Kiosha asks, who won the French and Indian War? It was the British who won the French and Indian War, and part of the reason that they ended up putting in these taxes because they were trying to make back some money that they lost during that time. Amelia, yes, there is a Washington Day. It's called President's Day, and we celebrate many, many presidents. Were their coats blue because the British were red? Yes, that's probably a really good guess, Elijah. And I think that is probably a good reason why they did that, why they had blue coats. Great. Why did they have the war with India? Well, it was the French and Indian War was because the French controlled had some land around the colonies that the British wanted, and they wanted to expand. So they fought a war to be able to do that. Somebody's read some books about George Washington, and he was a bad general at the beginning, a good general at the end. I think he definitely learned some things about being a general and being a leader, and how best to lead his people through all of this time that he did. So Milo, we will probably talk about the Battle of Gettysburg, but just not in this one, because we're kind of working our way through history. Interesting, Henry, about the colors. That could be very true. So as the fighting had started, but the colonists and what would become the Americans hadn't ever really said exactly what they wanted. Yes, they wanted to be independent or free from Britain, but it was important to say why they wanted to be independent, and to say it really, really clearly. They wanted to make sure that everybody, like England and the other countries and anyone who came back in history, could understand why they made this decision, and to also understand that it wasn't something where they asked to be independent and the king said no, and then they decided to fight a war, but to really go over all the reasons why they wanted to be independent and why they were declaring themselves independent. So Thomas Jefferson was given the job. Thomas Jefferson was given the job of writing the Declaration of Independence. And so in it, he said the power of the government should come from the people that are in the government. And he also said that people have rights that the government can't take away: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that was one of the first times where that had been said, that those were important, that the idea that the power that the government has comes from the people that make it up, and that there are certain rights that can't be taken away. Anjali, we will probably learn about the Battle of the Alamo, but when we get to it in time. Izzy asked, why did the British start these wars that caused people to die? Was it just to get more land or something more than that? They wanted to have more land. They wanted to expand the amount of land that they had. I believe at that time, many countries believed that the amount of land that was under their control showed how powerful or rich they were. So that was one of the things that they wanted. Elijah, yes, they did want to make sure. They wrote the Declaration of Independence because they wanted to make sure that people understood the reasons why they were fighting, the steps they had taken to solve the problems that they had with the King of England, and why they wanted to be independent. Henry, I'm not sure if Thomas Jefferson was paid. I know it was something he felt strongly about, so it is possible that he was paid, or just it was just something he wanted to do. Devin, yes, when I said the people of the government, I did mean the citizens. You're right. The citizens of the country, and them deciding who they want to have represent them in the government, and how they can vote for things and make their voice heard, is the way that the government gets its power per Thomas Jefferson. The King of England at the time was George III. Lila, you are right. It was a group of men who got together to write the Declaration of Independence and come up with the ideas and what they wanted to say, but the words themselves were written by Thomas Jefferson. You guys have great Great questions. Shana asks, why was having more land better? Because then you had more resources. You could maybe find gold, which was one of the things they really hoped to find in the New World. You would have trees that you could cut down to send wood back to your country. You could grow cotton or tobacco, which are just things which could make money. And Jolly, yes, Independence Day is the 4th of July, and that is the day that the Declaration of Independence was signed. Where is the Declaration of Independence now? It is on display in Washington, D.C. I think it's in the Smithsonian Museum, and it's obviously under like thick glass, but you can go and see it. That's a great question. There were 13 colonies in the beginning, Noah, and they added more afterwards, but originally the 13 colonies. Okay, so so in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson said that the only way that the colonies could have all those things were to be independent, have those things, to be able to have life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, to have the power of their government come from the citizens themselves and have them have a say, was to be independent from Britain. So on July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress, which were the colony leaders who got together and decided they were going to write the Declaration of Independence. They got together and they signed the Declaration of Independence. So that's the day it was signed. On July 4th, it became official. So that's why in America we call July 4th Independence Day. But that writing the Declaration of Independence and signing it was them just declaring or saying, these are the reasons we wanted to be independent and we are going to be independent. But they still had to fight a war to actually make it happen. Let's just see if there some great questions. What is a colony? A colony is an area of land that one country creates and sort of takes over in another country. And many times people who are from that original country come to move to live in this colony. Great question. Devin asked, so they had been fighting for more than a year before they signed the Declaration? Yes, there had been fighting happening because the colonists didn't jump straight to trying to fight a war to fight for independence. They took many different steps and tried to communicate and reach agreements with the King of England, and were trying to avoid, if they could, having to fight a war. And in the Declaration of Independence is a list of all those reasons they want to be independent, and also goes over a little bit briefly what they tried to do. That's a great question. Shana, I've never seen the Declaration myself, though I would love to, because I think it's such a cool document. Though I do have a copy, not a real copy, but I have a copy of it in my classroom too. Sophia, ask your question again. Sorry, I must have missed it in all these questions that I have. So winning the war was General Washington's job, and he was good at using sneaky plans to win battles. So the British army was much more powerful, and they had more ships, they had more guns, they had more supplies than the colonists, and there were more soldiers. So General Washington had to be sort of sneaky or really clever and smart about how he went about winning these battles. So at Trenton in New Jersey, later in 1776, he surprised them by attacking unexpectedly in the morning by crossing the river of the icy Delaware River, and he captured the whole British army at Trenton. So he got all of those guys, but the British had way more armies than just that. Sophia, ask your question again and I will try to answer it. Yes, and so this picture that is to the right is one of my favorite historical paintings ever. It's called Washington Crosses the Delaware. If you were in my first or second webinar, I talked about it a little bit. It doesn't look so huge on this presentation, but it actually is a ginormous painting. It takes up most of the wall in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City and is really just a beautiful, beautiful picture. Yes, and prior to this, the British Army, Shayna, you're right. They were celebrating Christmas the night before, and so they were a little worn out with all their partying, and then so then they were sleeping, and the Continental Army crossed the river and surprised them. Sophia, we have probably about 8 more minutes, so we're going to try to wrap up really quickly. And I'm sure they did name the state of Washington after President Washington. The reason he didn't attack at night was because they would have still been awake, but his idea was if he attacked really early in the morning after they had had a late night, they'd be sleeping and he'd be able to get them. So while George Washington won that battle, he didn't win all of his battles. So after he won at Trenton, he lost some other battles. And by late 1776, the next year, the Continental Army's troops were very unhappy. They camped at Valley Forge all through the winter, and they were very cold and very hungry. It was a really cold winter, but they didn't have enough supplies, sometimes they didn't have shoes, or they didn't have warm enough clothes or enough food to eat. But General Washington kept them together, and he used this time to train them into being better soldiers. So it was a useful time, but it was really hard for him. Izzy asks, what did women do during the war? I think they helped along the men however they could. I've read stories of women melting down their metal silverware and pots and pans to help make bullets, and to maybe find old bullets and melt them down so that they could make more. Shayna, I'm not sure how many people died during the winter at Valley Forge, but it was probably quite a lot because it was a rough time for them. And even after that long, cold, terrible winter, the war went on for 8 years. Finally, General Washington beat the British badly at Yorktown. He beat them very, very badly, and the king decided to end the war and give the 13 American colonies their independence. So in 1783, they were the United States of America. I have time for just a couple more questions. How long was the war? Noah asked. So they started fighting, I think in 1775 was the Battle of Concord and Lexington, and it went all the way to 1783. So it was a lot of people fighting. It took a long time, and the colonists had to be really tough and stick with what they believed and what they really wanted, because it wasn't easy. It wasn't an easy victory. Henry, no, George Washington crossing the Delaware isn't as big as the Sistine Chapel. but it is very big. Kiosha, what's a colony? A colony is an area of land, that one country establishes or creates in a new country to have their people live there. Let's see, I have a couple times for a couple more questions. Yes, Washington, D.C. was named after George Washington, most likely because he was the first president, but also because he was a really great leader and a great general, and he helped us win. Anjali, you're very welcome. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Henry, it probably is about a third as big. Okay, well, thank you guys so much for joining me for this webinar. I hope you learned something about the Revolutionary War. I'm going to be doing 2 more of these this week. We're going to talk about the Revolutionary War for a little bit longer, and then we'll move forward in history. So thanks so much. I hope you guys have a really good day.